Foreign affairs and international development issues often take a back seat in federal election campaigns. But this election began as the Taliban took control over Afghanistan, and the world is grappling with a global pandemic. Welcome back to In Focus with David Coletto. I'm David Coletto. On this episode of In Focus, I'm joined by Julia Anderson, the CEO at the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, or CanWatch for short. CanWatch has over 100 members ranging from NGOs, academic institutions, health professional associations, and individuals partnering to improve health outcomes for women and children in more than 1,000 communities worldwide. It has also been a client of mine for several years now. We sat down as week 2 of the federal election campaign comes to an end to talk about international development, the global pandemic, and a fascinating research project CanWatch commissioned to understand public attitudes surrounding foreign affairs and international development. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Julia Anderson. Well, Julia, thanks so much for joining the podcast today. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you as well. Really happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, I want to start on a really down note. We'll talk about politics and the federal election later, but it almost feels not that important given what's going on in Afghanistan. And as the head of a partnership of dozens and dozens of organizations that are working on the ground in countries all over the world, I'm hoping you could give our listeners a sense of your take on what's happening in Afghanistan and the humanitarian crisis that I'm sure has already started, but will likely go forward, and how aid organizations sort of deal with a situation like this and how it affects the work that you do.
Yeah, thanks for raising it. I mean, our hearts and collective minds and energies are just being sent to the folks on the ground in Afghanistan. We know that Canada played a role, and because of the role that it played, and we can, I hope in the months to come, we'll start to unpack kind of where we went right, where we went wrong with the role that we played. But for now, because we played a role, our first and foremost concern is the obligation that then creates to protect the people who supported us, who worked with us on the ground, to protect the people whom we supported to kind of live out the values that we espouse, such as women's rights, gender equality. I mean, I wrote an op-ed that came out today in the Star and talked about the call from the Ontario Midwives Association saying, look, we've got 105 refugee midwives that are currently in Canada that became refugees as a result of working on a mandate that's been very important to this government, sexual health and reproductive rights. So these were midwives supporting with contraceptives, supporting with births, all the things that midwives do in communities. And their families are currently in hiding in Afghanistan and in the neighboring countries. So I really saw that call as, there are no quick solutions here, but there are entry points. And let's follow the leads we have, and let's work as quickly as possible, and let's drop the red tape. We saw during the pandemic the ability of Global Affairs Canada to significantly shift its processes and its red tape, and I applaud the work that they did there. We need to double down on that work and just rip apart that red tape, quickly process the folks that are on the ground in neighboring countries. Because one thing you have to think about is, people are saying, well, we need to get people out of Afghanistan. Absolutely, that's true. But you also have Afghanis in neighboring countries who, once they're safely in Canada, that creates space, right? Because you actually run out of space for people to flee to in the direct and neighboring countries. So if we get and process folks that have been waiting, that have their, have passed all their UNHRC screening and all those kinds of things, the faster we can get them over here, that does on some level create some elasticity and some space for others to flee. So let's look for those entry points and let's just go. Canadians care about this. The government made an announcement today for additional resources. Great, but we're going to have to double down on in the months and years to come on that, because I mean, right now we're looking at a crisis, but the type of funding that actually averts future crisis is development and long-term funding. So it's all these things, and I think the most important thing is we keep the pressure on, we keep the attention on. I've been really pleased to see that Canadians and journalists and folks have been bringing this up on the campaign trail and saying this matters to Canadians. We see ourselves as having had a role here, and we're not going to just walk away. So let's keep up the pressure and keep people thinking about how to best act, and then just, supporting the actors with the kinds of mental health resources that they need when they come back. We've got a major community of veterans who are suffering right now because all this investment they made. Let's get them the resources, the mental health supports that they need. And I think we just need sort of a wraparound approach that's very, very quick. And the history books will tell us later what we could have done better, but let's not use getting it perfect as an excuse for inaction.
Yeah, it's come as I think a shock, but oftentimes these shocks, we knew this was coming, right? And often the case, these moments happen and everyone's shocked, but the evidence was there that this was going to be coming. Thoughts and best wishes to everyone who's in a really tough position right now. And yeah, you're right. I think Canadians are paying attention to it. If you're following any of the news, it's the lead now. We're in the middle of a federal election, but that's the second story, which I think shows how important people are placing on this.
Just one plug, UNICEF Canada. I mean, we've got a ton of members doing a ton of work, but UNICEF have publicly come out and said that they're staying on the ground and to ensure the rights and protection of every child. And so donations can go there. We've got other great partners working in the region and around. And I think at this moment, donations really matter, and they kind of put they put the resources in the hands of the people who are doing the work. So as much as the Canadian government needs to step up, we really encourage Canadians to get behind that as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. I want to switch gears slightly. No, not slightly. It's a pretty big shift. But, at the same time that Afghanistan is sort of in crisis, we're still in the middle of our own global crisis related to the pandemic. Here in Canada, most Canadians have been fully vaccinated. Most of the restrictions we've been living with are over. There's fear that maybe some of them are going to be coming back as cases rise. And the Delta variant is really worrying. And I know there's lots of debate in this election about vaccinating our own people. And now even, which I'm sure drives you crazy, conversations about third shots and sort of boosters, given that so few people in the developing world have even one, let alone two. I think, what from your perspective, from a global perspective, and the work your members are doing on the ground and your advocacy, and we'll talk a little bit about some polling we did in a minute, but what's the state of the pandemic, the global pandemic from your eyes, and the vaccine rollout happening in the developing world?
I think that's a great question. And it's a question, unfortunately, that's not getting as much attention as it needs to receive. So, I mean, just in the numbers, if you take 100 people in North America, 92 of them are fully vaccinated. That compares to 6.7 people across the continent of Africa. Like, just line those people up in your head and go, what is wrong with us? What are we thinking? And when it comes to the health security sort of arguments around variants and things like that, I mean, this is both a poor policy decision, because it's ultimately, how many are we going to get a booster every 6 months to protect us from the new variants that are really being allowed to fester and grow because of global inaction? Do we just want to stay on that treadmill, or do we want to actually get off that treadmill and address this thing to the best of our ability once and for all? And that requires, we could call it generosity, but we could also just call it smart policy of vaccinating the world. So, I mean, 0.3% of vaccines have been administered in low income countries. Like, that's just a wild thought when we're talking booster shots. So I think, Canada has stepped up. It's supported $1.3 billion to the global effort through the COVAX. We've made some government interventions that are smart and that are, considered generous among the G7. What I keep saying and what I think is really important is that the global bar is very low. The global bar for thinking about a global pandemic as a global challenge is very low. And so for Canada to step over that bar means absolutely nothing when it comes to actually addressing the scope and scale and magnitude of the challenge in front of us. So what I want to see from the government that I elect, as a taxpayer, as a Canadian, I want to see them actually being propositionable about how to raise that bar. How do we get to the point where we're having a smart global conversation about vaccinating the world, about getting production, supply, and delivery out to every single citizen of this planet that wants a vaccine, eliminating, therefore, or reducing the risk of variants, and actually enabling sort of a return to trade, to a thriving global economy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I'd love to see. That's not where the conversation is at. It's really stuck at this kind of, how much are we going to give to the ACT and the COVAX? That's not where we need to be. We need our health experts to crowd in and talk about what ambition would really look like and how Canada could start, at the G7 and other places raising that bar.
I mean, your point about this treadmill, when you use that visual, it really what it's going to become unless we solve this, right? Like this idea that we're having some trouble getting people to take a second shot. How much trouble are we going to have when people are going to need to take a third or a fourth or a fifth if these variants keep emerging from places that haven't had one, right? Because we aren't dealing with it. And we did some polling with your organization earlier this year. We followed up with some work for World Vision that showed, the public isn't offside with that idea. They recognize overwhelmingly that if we don't end the pandemic everywhere, it's not over. And our self-interest is tied to the self-interest of everybody. That this pandemic has, I always think about it personally, but I think Canadians generally understand that it's shrunk our world. It hasn't shrunk our world. It's shown how small our world is.
Yeah.
And that's true of not just a virus. It's true of economic inequality, of social inequality. Those things spread and they have impacts on us here. And so I guess bringing it back to politics for a minute, why don't we see, our political leaders connecting the dots and showing people that, we should be talking and focused to some extent of what's happening here in Canada, but I haven't heard, I don't believe, and I haven't followed every single word that the leaders have uttered, but I haven't heard, at least covered, anyone talking about how a back to normal strategy here in Canada has to include a global response that's bigger and more bold than what we've done so far, right? Does that surprise you? Like, I'm sure it disappoints you, but why do you think that's the case? You've been working in this world of, international development and official assistance for a long time. Like, what's holding these political leaders back?
Yeah, I think part of it, I can't speak for them, but I think part of it is, and it actually relates to the Afghanistan question too. I heard someone on a podcast saying, there's no easy button on this one. And like that old Staples easy button, that was easy. There's no easy button. I think if there was an obvious and concrete solution to this global problem, you could probably crowd some financing in. So Canada would probably show up and it did to an extent for the ACT. I think when asked, Canada will show up. And I think politicians would, then you could pose a question, will you donate this much money? Will you give this? Sure, they can answer those questions. I think the challenge right now is it's almost a global policy challenge where we don't know. We know some of the questions. We don't know the answers. We need to do the thinking. We don't have the institutions in a strong enough position like the World Health Organization, the United Nations, and others. They're not fit for purpose to really take on the thinking required to solve this particular challenge. You see similar echoes of this in the climate change and
Mm-hmm.
sort of environmental movement, where it's like, well, in some ways, the politicians are playing to this desire to have the answers, to give the answers, and to say what they're going to do, as opposed to getting really smart and systems curious and saying, what can we do? Where can the solutions be? I mean, treating it more like scientists rather than preachers or
Yeah.
prosecutors, as Adam Grant talks about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a great answer, but I think it's not a straightforward answer, but I think what we need to see and what we want to see and what Canadians should be demanding is that there's a strategy to think through this, right? We don't need to demand that the answers are this way or that, but that there's a strategy to think through this, and that there's attention to it, right? And that there's a recognition that there's no, this budget came out and it was like, oh, this is a domestic budget, a strong domestic budget. There's just no strong domestic policy without a coherent and strong foreign policy that takes into consideration the biggest global threat that has, kind of been chasing us for decades, which is inequality, right? Like, you just don't have, and if you look at climate, if you look at racial injustice, if you look at gender equality, and like all those things fall under that big bucket of inequality. And if we don't get really smart about thinking through what are the long-term sustainable solutions to that, Canada is not going to fare well. I mean, Canada is a medium-sized country. It depends on the multilateral. It depends on good global engagement. Canadians are not going to do well until the politicians and until, I guess, we start demanding more when it comes to foreign policy thinking and long-term solutions.
And you use climate change as a parallel or an example of the challenge sometimes of coordinating a global response to a crisis. But from just a domestic public opinion perspective, climate change is another issue where I actually think, just like our global response to the pandemic, how we engage with lower income countries and support them in developing, like that the public is ahead of the politicians, that the public seems to get it, and the politicians are afraid or not willing, or some version of both of those to engage back. And I think that's a mistake. I do the polling. I've tested multiple ways of showing that, putting, an investment in official assistance, development assistance is not going to win you an election. You and I can both agree on that. But to not include it as part of the broader context, to show the country that you get how this world works. I just get, I see it void of all our leaders. I'm not being partisan. It's just like, whether you're the current prime minister or you want to be the prime minister, it feels like Canadians are being left with only part of the story. And that leaves them wondering, like, do you actually know what the outcome needs to be? And I agree with you. You don't have to have the solution, because this is a really complicated issue, but at least you have to tell me that you know how we need to get there. Like, what is the outcome we have to achieve? And so I just think there's a political opportunity that's being left on the table here to integrate that global perspective into domestic politics. That, I don't think Canada's alone, by the way. I think that happens in many countries around the world, but we seemingly are extra insular in our inability to bring foreign policy and other issues globally into our own politics.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, one, I guess it could be portrayed as positive possibility. And again, there's no real right answer on this. But one thing that I think about sometimes is the reason that this doesn't come up in the political imagination in the way that we would hope it would, for kind of throwing solutions out there, testing them, thinking through, putting positions out, because actually the parties are fairly aligned. So it's not an issue in which, and especially during election time, disagreement helps, right? You don't put out issues into the world where you all agree, because that wouldn't make sense, because then people don't know what to vote for. You talk about things, wedge issues, things you disagree on, things where there's policy distinctions. So the my democratic hope is that the reason we don't talk about this during this period as much is because there is kind of alignment, which would allow for a consistency of foreign policy, which is quite helpful. So that's a possibility. The other possibility, which I wish I could quote who said this, but it was at an event, and I can't remember who the person was, but they were talking about how if you look at history, prime ministers come into their real foreign policy chops kind of after a second or third mandate, or into the end of their second, like sort of on their way out. They come into the statesperson persona, and if you looked, they were looking across parties, so not just not with one political bent, but this notion that someone's really focused in as a leader of a party domestically as they take their first mandates, and then they grow into a statesperson role that has to look out into the world. And I thought that was compelling and interesting because, Jean Chrétien, like Martin, Mulrooney, like they were all kind of Joe Clark, like they were all in and around this event where we were talking about that, and it was all foreign policy oriented. And I thought that's kind of interesting, right? That's an interesting idea that as you come into a later mandate, you start looking out into the world. And so in that way, if the Liberals were to take office again, and we would, if the Prime Minister were to think that this is his last mandate, what opportunity is that for Canadians to demand, okay, now it's time to show up in that statesperson role. We want to see it. We've given you your time, but now we want to see this. And certainly I'll be, as an advocate, taking that angle if that's what happens. And if it's an O'Toole government, if it's a Singh government, I would maybe push for an early entrance into that state personhood, because I think the time is now.
Just briefly, you mentioned sort of the potential that there is some consensus, and that's why we don't talk about it or we don't debate it, because most of the parties agree. I mean, it wasn't long ago where you actually had a Conservative Party leader running an election promising to cut foreign official development assistance by 25%, right? And realizing that there may be political gain to actually be seen as like pulling out, not engaging more. But it's interesting to me that Aaron O'Toole, the current Conservative leader, has, a few months ago said that's not going to be our position, that we're not going to cut aid. So I think there's evidence here that like you can, again, you're not going to lead with foreign issues during an election, but it can be part of the broader image that you create of yourself, that you're worldly, you understand, and that's ultimately what I think part of what Canadians are looking for in a prime minister, right? Like, yes, you take care of our house, but you worry about the threats outside of it, right? Like, it's part of the job description. So anyways, I think, I don't know if a lot of political strategists or staffers are listening to this podcast, but maybe, there's some advice there on the final few weeks of the campaign. In the final 10 minutes, I do want to talk about a really interesting project that CanWatch completed earlier this year. This is a polling and research podcast, so I'd be remiss not to talk about this study. And I'll just describe it. So earlier this year, CanWatch, your organization, partnered with Stanford University, the Canadian International Council, and Global Canada, and Foreign Policy by Canadians to conduct some really interesting research. But this was not just, a typical survey or a focus group that are good research methods, but you went deeper and you conducted what is called a deliberative poll or a deliberative research exercise, where you had a representative group of 444 Canadians, and you took them through, survey. First, you started with a survey of 4 key foreign policy areas. Then each one of them took part in an 8 to 12 hour small group discussion and debate session, which then was followed by another survey. And the objectives in this design are to see when you actually get people engaged and talking and informed about these issues, how do their views and perspectives change, right? And hence the deliberative side of this research. And so, and then what you did is you took those 444 folks who were engaged and you compared them to a control group of 300 who weren't engaged in this conversation, in this debate. And so I've got so many questions about this project, but I just want to start from your perspective about what you learned about Canadian public opinion about foreign policy, specifically around CanWatch's real focus, which is global public health and human dignity, and what, if anything, really surprised you from both the process of doing this research and the outcomes and the findings that you had.
Yeah, I mean, this was such a fun project. And if I were to develop a side hustle in addition to my role at CanWatch, it would be to go province to province and undertake this exercise of deliberative polling on a whole range of issues that I'm curious about, because it was the first time that I felt like, I love polling and I love getting that snapshot in time, but I'm always left with a lack of understanding of why people held the beliefs that they did, and what are the factors that influence their opinion formation, and yes, what are the factors that can shift their opinions on things, and what arguments stand up to the test of other arguments, and what arguments don't. So this was fascinating. I mean, the number one takeaway is that Canadians are deeply interested and willing to wade through the murky murky mud of foreign policy. They're willing to actually engage in the conversation that's nuanced, complex, cannot be communicated in a sound bite. There are no easy buttons, no simple answers, and they're willing to have those conversations. And they're willing to have those conversations, especially when the alternative views are put in front of them. So I think often in the kind of social change space that I work in, that is often trying to shift public opinion, we focus a lot on, augmenting and building up an argument for something, and we kind of ignore or avoid the argument against something. So we get this in our space. I care a lot about global equity, and I care a lot about how Canada shows up on the world. And I'm often challenged, well, what about here at home? Which I just find, I understand why people do it, but it's kind of ridiculous. I don't understand why good has to fight with good. Right. Is there some sort of limit on the amount of good we can do in the world, or the amount of obligation we have to make the world a better place? But anyways, that argument, we're often dodging and avoiding it, as opposed to talking about and exploring, yes, if we make these choices, what are the implications then here at home? So we got a learning out of this that I hadn't really explored at this level of depth. That Canadians want to see consistency. They have a lot of humility, but they want to see consistency. They don't want us out preaching on a global stage if they cannot see the direct engagement and work on that particular set of issues here at home. Women in leadership, women's health, sexual health and reproductive rights, and everything down to access issues to contraceptives. Well, if we don't have a national pharmacare plan that gets women across this country and men access to contraceptives, why are we going, on a global stage to Family Planning 2030 to talk about that? That doesn't mean don't do it. In fact, Canadians told us unequivocally, yes, do it here and do it there. Come on, we are a wealthy, well-endowed country. We can do this wherever we want to do it, and we need to do it in both places. So that was a huge learning for me. There were some linguistic learnings about the way that you use, the F word, feminist. I really thought that we'd get a lot of resistance to that word when it came to foreign policy conversations. What we saw, in fact, was that we moved conservatives from those who identified as conservatives, had a 36% support in advance of the deliberative exercise for a feminist foreign policy. Once they got and understood what we meant by that word, that went over to majority support. So just what you can do with a little bit of time, that's what I took away from this, is just
and the power of a word, right? As much as you and others may identify it with that word strongly, for others it is like they react. And so it's so fascinating. What it shows is that once you actually explain what feminism means and how it's put into action, they can get behind it, right? So it's just the power that the politicization of words itself. And when we live in a world where, we're fighting over, a dozen or more characters on a tweet, it just reaffirms the power of a single word to just turn people off. But that deep down, this is my point. Like, we agree far more in principle on many more things, but the words we use are sometimes weaponized, right? And used against or for things. Really interesting, because I think, deliberative polling has a place in almost every public policy and communications efforts, because, as someone who spends my entire day asking people questions, I've come to see that, the public is generally informed enough about the things that they need to be informed of, but for most people, they don't have the time to spend becoming fully informed, like you are, about what you are an expert of and care deeply about. But it doesn't mean they don't want to or won't when asked. And there's like this, sometimes we fall into this trap by assuming that people are dumb or people are simplistic, when in reality, we are pulled by cues and heuristics and all this kind of, there's this whole literature on like why, the power of framing, but that doesn't mean you can't break people out of those with a conversation, right? Yes. And with being just honest about the conversation, as opposed to sometimes our politics becomes, in many ways dishonest in terms of how we talk about issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a hopeful project it was in that regard, because being in the space of looking at, maternal mortality globally, vaccine equity globally, climate change. These challenges seem so grand and so complex. And then when you add to that the dumbing down or the simplicity, and as you said, how much can you fit into a tweet or a 10 characters that's going to get picked up because you're trying to get your message across, it can be really almost put you into a state of paralysis of action, because it just feels like you're chipping away at something that's way too big. So to sit and observe 444 Canadians from coast to coast to coast, taking the time and digging into the nuance and being willing to grapple with true trade-offs. It was just so incredibly hopeful. And I think that, my real learning is that no party should stand up and say after our exercise, which I think is was a truly representative sample of Canadians, no party should stand up and say, we can ignore foreign policy, right? Foreign policy doesn't matter. Foreign policy, yes, you may need to take people along a journey of why it matters. You may need to explain and sort of be willing to grapple with the nuance. But once you do that, I think this could become a much larger focal point for Canadian identity, Canadian values, etc. If we're willing to go there. And what I saw was a real willingness on the part of Canadians.
For anyone interested in this report or details on how it was done, if you're curious on the methodology, just go to Google and search CAN Watch, WACH for watch, and then deliberative poll, and it will be the first thing on your search terms. It's called Foreign Policy by Canadians, and highly recommend take a look. Last, a brief question, brief answer if you can. Week 2 of the campaign's almost done. What do you want to hear more of from the leaders in the next 3 weeks?
Let's get ambitious. Let's get bold. Let's put some big ideas on the table and debate them. And we've thrown out some of the ideas that I think were really distracting, like cutting ODA. We've got some foreign policy in the platforms that we've seen so far. Let's have the conversation. And I have some ideas about where I want that conversation to go and some policy directions, which I would love to see. But at the end of the day, I just would love to see a conversation about what we can do in the world, what we ought to do in the world, what that means for what we're going to do here in Canada, how we're going to square those two circles, and let's have the conversation.
Well, Julia, thank you so much for taking some time to walk us through what's probably a very busy time for you, given all the stuff going on in the world. So thanks for giving a little bit of it to us, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me again.